The teachings of Bahá'u'lláh form the basis of mankind's newest world religion. That the Bahá'í faith is a world-encompassing religion is beyond dispute. Now established in 235 countries and territories, and adopted by people representing more than 2,000 tribes, cultures, and ethnic groups, its followers number in the millions. This faith, founded less than 200 years ago, is well able to lay claim to what the Encyclopedia Britannica describes as the second most widespread religion in the world. What is not so immediately clear is how it has been able to do this. There is no clergy of any kind, no rabbis, no priests, no mullahs. Its rank and file are as diverse as any organization on the planet and include some of the most disadvantaged people. It only accepts voluntary donations from declared believers, and its followers must obey the laws of their respective governments, despite blatant persecution in some countries, most notably Iran, the birthplace of its founder, Bahá'u'lláh. To try to understand this phenomenon, we may well look to the life of Bahá'u'lláh. Herein lies a story historically accurate, yet just as puzzling as the meteoric rise of the faith that bears his name.
In 1863, a man from Persia named Bahá'u'lláh made an astonishing claim, a claim for which he would suffer nearly 30 years of attack, exile, and imprisonment. He was, he said, the most recent in a long line of messengers sent by God. The revelation he brought to humanity fulfilled the prophecies of earlier religions. His mission was to lay the groundwork for the unification of the peoples of the world and the establishment of world peace. Such an extraordinary assertion needs to be considered carefully because, if true, it demands a response. Is Bahá'u'lláh who he said he was? This is an opportunity to investigate his claim, to examine his life, and to reflect on his teachings. For the first time in history, we have a detailed record of the birth of a new religion and the life of its founder. We are living in a time so close to that remarkable life that we have photographs, government documents, written accounts, and artifacts. As a messenger of God, Bahá'u'lláh was more than just a philosopher, a great thinker, or a creator of a new ideology. He had the power, like all the messengers of the past, to effect a fundamental and lasting change in people's hearts. He was the fulfillment of the promise of all ages. Bahá'u'llah's mission began in a subterranean dungeon in 1852, but long before then it was clear that he was unique. Bahá'u'lláh was a descendant of the kings of ancient Persia. His mother noticed that even as a baby he never cried or became restless. As he grew up, he was extremely kind and generous and showed early signs of exceptional intelligence. He never attended school, yet by the time he was 13, his wisdom and insight were legendary, so much so that the religious leaders turned to him for explanations of difficult passages in the Quran, the holy book of Islam. His father was a minister at the royal court, and everyone assumed that Bahá'u'lláh would follow in his footsteps. They were surprised when he chose instead to devote himself to caring for the needy, becoming known as Father of the Poor.
He lived in the northernmost province of Persia, Mazandaran, a very high mountain district, very rough country like our Rocky Mountains. And in this mountain country, Baha'u'lláh grew up in the traditions of the land and in the traditions of Shia Islam. He was a youth of great talent and great capacity from the very beginning, as everyone saw it. And many people commented on his speech like a rushing torrent, as he was articulate in the extreme. He was brilliant, sufficiently so that he dared to take on mullahs, priests, and there are many stories of his undertaking such debates with people way beyond his age and purportedly beyond his knowledge. So it is quite fair to say that he had inherent knowledge, and the best story of this, by all odds, is the fact that when he was approximately 7 years old, he tells the story of how he had a number of days of what I would call transfiguration. That is, he felt within himself the power of the Spirit. And from this time forth, he, I'm sure, knew well his noble and his supernal destiny as a prophet of God.
The early 19th century was a time of great change brought about by rapid advances in science and industry. The British, Ottoman, and Prussian empires held vast territories in their choking grasp. The new American democracy was struggling to establish itself and stumbling towards civil war. In China, the 200-year-old Qing dynasty was crumbling. All over the world, people were turning to their scriptures to help them understand what was happening. In Europe and America, many were convinced that the upheavals signaled that the time for the return of Jesus Christ had come. In Scotland, Sir Edward Irving prophesied the second coming was at hand. In Germany, Georg David Hardegg and his Templars sold up everything and moved to the Holy Land to await Christ's return. In America, there was Joseph Smith of the Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, Mary Baker Eddy and the Christian Scientists, and William Miller and his followers who later became known as Seventh-day Adventists. In the Middle East, Islamic scholars expected the appearance of not one but two new prophets. In Persia, Sheikh Ahmad and his successor Sayyid Kazim promoted the belief the prophecies of the Quran and Islamic traditions concerning these twin messengers of God would soon be fulfilled. In the East, where all the prophets of God have appeared, attention began to focus on an extraordinary young man from Shiraz in Persia, who called himself the Bab, or Gate. He already had a reputation for great wisdom and saintly character, and his announcement in 1844 that he was the one promised in Islamic scripture stirred hope and excitement across Persia. He said humanity stood on the threshold of a new age, and his mission was to bring fresh teachings to assist in the spiritual and social transformation that was necessary as a precursor to this new age. More importantly, however, his purpose was to prepare the people for the coming of a second, even greater messenger of God, one foretold in all the religions. The Muslim clergy reacted with violent hostility. They had always taught that Muhammad was the last messenger of God, so to them, the Bab's claim was heresy punishable by death. Thousands of Babis, as the followers of the Bab were called, died at the hands of mobs incited by a fanatical clergy. The Bab himself was interrogated, beaten, and imprisoned several times, but his message continued to attract converts. The government grew alarmed, and ultimately in 1850, the order was given for the Bab's public execution by firing squad. At the moment of his death, a sudden fierce windstorm whipped up a cloud of dust that darkened the sun until nightfall.
The Bab is a very, very unique figure in religious history. For the first time since the inception of the long education of humanity stimulated by God through what we call progressive revelation, we have an independent manifestation of God, the Bab, who ushered in not only an independent dispensation, 9 years duration, very short, under which all humanity came under that umbrella. He was also the herald or a precursor to what in his own words was yet a greater revelation of God's might and power that was to come. And that was in the form of, the term he used was, him whom God shall make manifest, which we now know as Bahá'u'lláh. So it's easy to see how people can feel a little confused about who the Bab is, because we have John the Baptist was a herald, but not a manifestation of God. We have Bahá'u'lláh, the Bab, who should principally be known as the manifestation of God with his own independent revelation and dispensation, who also heralded. And what we see here is the Bab's revelation, his dispensation, closed the door on what's called the Adamic cycle. That's all the messengers of God and prophets of God who preceded the coming of the Bab, from Adam right up through to Muhammad. And he opens the door on the new cycle, the cycle of fulfillment, the Conference of Badash, where it was fascinating. You have three principal figures there and one in the background. The one in the background is the Bab because he's in prison. You have Bahá'u'lláh or Mirza Hussein Ali. You have Ali Muhammad, who was the Qudus, who became known as Qudus, and Tahirih, who was then known as Bahá'u'lláh. And in the conference of Badash, they thought they were going to be there to figure out a way to spring the Bab from jail, liberate him from prison. But that wasn't the intention of that meeting. It was there to help divest them of their appendages to the old faith of Islam and to become sort of new creations in the light of the revelation of the Bab. One of the things that happened in that meeting says that the Bahá'u'lláh each day revealed tablets or letters, and he addressed the members, people participating in that conference, by different names, by new names. He gave them new names. He gave Ali Muhammad the name of Qudus. He gave Bahá'u'lláh the name of Tahirih, and he took for himself the name Baha. Then it was very interesting because when I was reading on, it says some of the believers, some of the Babis, were upset with the behavior of Bahá'u'lláh or Tahirih. What they were concerned about was she took off her veil. That was a high sign of disrespect and so forth, and loss of purity even, in the presence of men who were not members of her own family. She spoke in the company of men, which is something women did not do. A number of other things. So they went eventually to the Bab and complained to the Bab. And the Bab said, in effect, what can I say? When he who is the source of power and honesty and majesty has given her the name Tahirih, the pure one. And that was the end of that conversation, what have you. I mean, think about these things. And I think, Bob and Bahá'u'lláh, they never met. They never met in person. At least we have no record of them having met. Even though they went to the same cities, but they were there at different times, what have you. But there was this genuine, loving relationship where the Bab and his writings would refer to him whom God would make manifest. And he says of the one who was to come after him, that we know as Bahá'u'lláh. He said of his own revelation, he says, my revelation, when compared to him whom God will make manifest, is less than the ring on my little finger.
Of the Babis who remained after the first wave of martyrdoms, one stood out among the rest. The Bab had given him the title of Bahá'u'lláh, the glory of God, and had shown him special love and respect. Just before the Bab was executed, he had sent Bahá'u'lláh his papers and seals, a sign that all should turn to him for leadership. Barely 2 years after the Bab's execution, a new storm broke upon the Babi community, one that set in motion a series of imprisonments and exiles that would dominate the rest of Bahá'u'llah's life. 2 young Babis, driven nearly mad by what they had seen done to their fellow believers, attempted an assassination of the king of Persia. Their pathetic and clumsy plot failed, and both were executed. Convinced that there must have been accomplices, and spurred by the fury of the king's mother who demanded revenge, a reign of terror that was revolting beyond description was unleashed upon the Babi community. The heads of 200 victims were impaled on bayonets and carried in triumphant procession from Shiraz to Abadi. 40 women and children were burned alive in a cave, and 300 women were stripped almost naked and led between rows of the severed heads of their husbands, fathers, sons, and brothers. These were but a few of the abuses inflicted upon the hapless Babis. Bahá'u'lláh was staying in the village of Afche, near the capital, when news of the assassination attempt reached him. As a prominent supporter of the Bab's cause, he was suspected of involvement in the plot, and the mother of the king was calling for his head. Instead of hiding, he set out the next morning for Tehran to answer any accusations being leveled against him. He was seized by the king's officers in Neyafaran on the outskirts of Tehran. They put him in chains and forced him to march for about 15 kilometers at the pace of their horses. The turban was knocked from his head, and his outer garments were ripped off, leaving him unprotected from the blazing August sun, and the stones with which the jeering mobs who had lined the route pelted him. His shoes had also been taken, and the sharp stones cut his feet. Bahá'u'lláh was thrown into the notorious Siyah Chal, the Black Pit, a rat-infested dungeon which had once been a reservoir for the public baths. There he was singled out for special cruelty. A heavy steel collar around his neck supported chains weighing more than 50 kilograms and cut so deeply into his flesh that the bones of his shoulders were exposed. When he did not succumb quickly to the torture, as had been expected, an attempt was made to poison him. Bahá'u'lláh described his experience in the Siyah Chal.
We were consigned for 4 months to a place foul beyond comparison. The dungeon was wrapped in thick darkness, and our fellow prisoners numbered nearly 150 souls. Thieves, assassins, and highwaymen. Though crowded, it had no other outlet than the passage by which we entered. No pen can depict that place, nor any tongue describe its loathsome smell. Most of these men had neither clothes nor bedding to lie on. God alone knoweth what befell us in that most foul-smelling and gloomy place.
It was in these circumstances, faced with his own imminent death, that Bahá'u'lláh received the first intimation of his mission, which he was not to make known for several years.
One night, in a dream, these exalted words were heard on every side. Verily, we shall render thee victorious by thyself and by thy pen. Grieve thou not for that which hath befallen thee, neither be thou afraid, for thou art in safety. Ere long will God raise up the treasures of the earth, men who will aid thee through thyself and through thy name, wherewith God hath revived the hearts of such as have recognized him. During the days I lay in the prison of Tehran, though the galling weight of the chains and the stench-filled air allowed me but little sleep, still in those infrequent moments of slumber, I felt as if something flowed from the crown of my head over my breast, even as a mighty torrent that precipitateth itself upon the earth from the summit of a lofty mountain. Every limb of my body would as a result be set afire. At such moments, my tongue recited what no man could bear to hear.
Bahá'u'llah's brother-in-law was secretary to the Russian envoy, who agreed to use his position to discover whether there was any truth to the allegations against Bahá'u'lláh with regard to his involvement in the plot to take the king's life. His investigations proved Bahá'u'llah's innocence, and the king was forced to accept that Bahá'u'lláh had had nothing to do with it. And so, after 4 months in the Siat Chal, Bahá'u'lláh was released. For the rest of his life, he carried the scars from the chains they had placed on his shoulders. He had been poisoned, he had been tortured, the soles of his feet had been whipped until they were raw, becoming badly infected in the filthy cell. But his spirit had been transformed by the revelation he had received while in the black pit. Bahá'u'lláh was banished from Persia and given only 10 days to prepare for the journey into exile. While he had been imprisoned, his properties and other assets had been confiscated and his family thrown out onto the street. They had lived in wealth and comfort, but with Bahá'u'llah's imprisonment came the struggle just to survive.
The younger sister of Baha'u'lláh, Nisa, was married to the secretary of the Russian ambassador, Prince Dolgorukov. Now, Russia, you know, was a very powerful force in Iran, because always it stood on that northern border, hungrily hoping to conquer Persia ultimately and have a warm water port in the Persian Gulf. And very recently, a minor war had been fought with Iran. So the Russian ambassador had a particular point of strength. And when Baha'u'lláh was finally the only Babi left, the powers that were working to free him included his own relatives and friends who sought to get this innocent nobleman out of prison and forgiven. And at the hearing for Baha'u'lláh, Dolgorukov, very boldly and highly presumptuously for an ambassador, rose in the court, asked for permission to speak, and then spoke, saying, "You will not kill this man. If you kill him, the streets of Tehran will run with blood. I promise you this from my government." I don't know how much of it was bluff or how much was real in the mind of the ambassador, but it was a very bold thing to do, and the result was a pardon of a kind and a freedom, and Baha'u'lláh was able now to leave the prison, the Siachal, and went to his half-brother's home. The half-brother was a doctor, the kind they had in those days, and as a sick, malnourished invalid with wounds from the heavy shackles that he had from the malnutrition of under feeding, of course, very limited feeding, he now had a period of time to recuperate, because the sentence of freeing had also been a sentence of exile.
It was the middle of winter when Baha'u'lláh and his family set out, under guard, across the mountains to Baghdad. He was still terribly ill and weak, and his wounds were not yet healed. Nawab was 8 months pregnant, but endured the jolting trek by mule without complaint. They had made the agonizing decision to leave Mehdi behind, afraid that a 4-year-old would not survive the journey. It would be several years before they were reunited. At night, the exiles camped in the wilderness, or if they were in a town, they stayed in the roughest of inns. They were allowed no lamps, and the whole family was crowded into a single unfurnished room. Sometimes they were able to have tea, or to share a few eggs, a little cheese, and some coarse bread. In each village where the caravan stopped, Nawab would go to the public bath and scrub their clothes. Her hands, unaccustomed to rough work, became raw and painful. It was almost impossible to dry the clothes, which even then did little to keep out the bitter cold. The journey to the neighboring territory of Iraq lasted 3 months. Once in Baghdad, the exhausted exiles settled among the Babis who had fled the persecutions in Persia. Baha'u'lláh quickly realized that there was little unity among the Babis in Baghdad. The martyrdom of the Bab and so many leaders of his cause had left his followers confused and disheartened. Different people, each professing to have been appointed by the Bab, claimed the leadership. For a year, Baha'u'lláh tried to heal the dissension, but his efforts only aroused jealousy. So that he should not add to the disunity, he decided to withdraw to the mountains of Kurdistan, telling no one where he was going.
The one object of our retirement was to avoid becoming a subject of discord among the faithful, a source of disturbance unto our companions, the means of injury to any soul, or the cause of sorrow to any heart.
For 2 years, Bahá'u'lláh lived as a hermit in the mountain caves. He subsisted on bread and cheese and had only one set of clothes. Though his life was simple and hard, he took intense pleasure in the peace and solitude, the last he would ever enjoy. The Kurdish peasants soon learned of a wise and holy dervish living in the mountains and began to go to him for advice and for guidance in settling disputes. It was not long before stories about Bahá'u'lláh filtered back to Baghdad.
There is a story that moves me very much as a mother. It's the story of how Nawab treated Mirza Yahya while Bahá'u'lláh had left Baghdad and was in exile in Kurdistan, in voluntary exile. For 2 years he was away from his family and she didn't know where he was. And she had to continue to keep the family together and look after everybody's needs. And Bahá'u'lláh had told her before he left that she was to treat his half-brother Mirza Yahya with the utmost love and respect. And she had done this. She cooked for him and she cleaned for him and she looked after every need and every comfort. But Mirza Yahya was becoming stranger and more subject to paranoid delusion as time went on, and he wouldn't go out into the streets unless he was in disguise. He wouldn't speak to the Babis. He hid himself from everybody because he was afraid that he was going to be murdered or taken into prison, and he feared this greatly. So when Nawab's young baby fell ill and she asked for a doctor to come to the house, he forbade it because he was afraid that any doctor might be a spy or an agent for the government come to put him in prison. And so the baby grew more ill. And when Nawab asked again for a doctor to be sent, Mirza Yahya refused, and the child died. And even then, Mirza Yahya would not allow Nawab to leave the house to bury the child, and instead wrapped the corpse in rags and opened the door of the house just a crack to pass the body out to someone waiting outside who he had paid to bury the child. And Nawab never knew where her child was buried, never was able to go there to say prayers or to grieve as a mother would grieve. And what amazes me so much is that even after that, she did not allow her heart to be filled with anger toward Mirza Yahya, but continued instead to serve him with such gentleness and kindness out of obedience to Bahá'u'lláh.
Bahá'u'llah's family had been looking for him for 2 years. Upon hearing of the Kurdish dervish, they knew that their search was over. They immediately sent a faithful friend to appeal to Bahá'u'lláh to come back to Baghdad. Reluctantly, Bahá'u'lláh returned to the provincial capital and was saddened to find that 2 years had only increased the problems in the Babi community. The activities of a few had brought scorn and disgrace on them all. Bahá'u'lláh went to work patiently rebuilding the community, gradually earning the trust and respect of the people of Baghdad and the dignitaries of the city. He fed the poor, arranged doctors for the sick, and cared for the orphans and widows. Although Bahá'u'lláh had not told anyone of the revelation he had received in the darkness of the prison in Tehran, many of the Babis found themselves mysteriously drawn to him and came to realize that he must be the one heralded by the Bab. The books and tablets Bahá'u'lláh wrote during these years, including the Four Valleys, the Seven Valleys, the Hidden Words, and the Book of Certitude, were clearly beyond ordinary human capabilities. The Muslim clergy and the representative of the Persian government in Baghdad were alarmed by Bahá'u'llah's growing prestige. They were afraid that the growth of the Babi cause in Iraq would reignite interest in Persia, so they pressured the Ottoman authorities to send Bahá'u'lláh deeper into the interior of the empire. The order for Bahá'u'llah's new banishment was expressed as a courteous invitation to come to Constantinople as a guest of the Ottoman government. In the 7 years since his return to Baghdad from the mountains, Bahá'u'lláh had won over the hostile population. Understandably, the news of his banishment caused an uproar in the city. Young and old, the poor, the wealthy, outcasts and officials, they flocked to his home to express their anger, confusion, and grief. Seeing that Bahá'u'llah's house was too small to receive them all, one of the notables of the city offered the use of his private park, located just outside Baghdad on the Tigris River. As Bahá'u'lláh walked through the streets to the bank of the river, the way was lined with people anxious to see him one last time or to touch his robe as he passed. He distributed among the poor the money which had been provided to cover the expenses of his journey. He comforted those who wept, and he blessed the babies and the children that mothers held out to him. Bahá'u'lláh and a few of his companions crossed the Tigris by ferry to the private park, which later became known as the Garden of Rizwan, or Paradise. Bahá'u'llah's family were to join him there once preparations for the journey to Constantinople were complete. The 4 avenues of the park were lined with roses, fragrant in the warm spring air. Large tents had been pitched for Bahá'u'lláh and his companions, and there he remained for 12 days, receiving the many visitors who came to pay their respects. It was on the first day of his stay in the Garden of Rizwan that Bahá'u'lláh chose to reveal his true station to his close companions, a station he had concealed for the 10 years since it had been revealed to him at the Siyat Chal.
This is the day in which mankind can behold the face and hear the voice of the Promised One. The call of God hath been raised, and the light of his countenance hath been lifted up upon men.
I think the story of the declaration of Bahá'u'lláh is fundamental. And I think a spiritual thing happened on those days that mankind is largely unaware of. What happened during those days was the fulfillment of a prophecy since time immemorial, the coming of God's kingdom of God on earth. And I think something more important happened during that time. In the Bible, in many of the holy writings, it talks about all things being made new. And in the Rizwan tablet that Baha'u'lláh revealed just before the coming of his departure from Baghdad, talks specifically about a time when God says specifically, all things have passed away and expired. And then with another word said, all things have been gathered together in a new creation. And this is the story then that we're talking about. We're talking about a story of anticipation, thousands of years of revealed revelation from God, anticipating the coming of that exact moment in time. And the fulfillment of those promises. Because it was going to take over 100 days to walk and go by horse from Baghdad up to Constantinople, the travelers had to camp out for a period of time to get themselves organized for the trip. In other words, if you forget the can opener, then the beans don't, you can't get to the beans. So they camp out for a period of time before they're ready to actually begin the journey. And a very wealthy person in Baghdad had a garden across the river, which the Baha'is refer to the Garden of Rizwan, the Garden of Paradise. And he made this garden available to Bahá'u'lláh and his family and his friends to begin to prepare for this long and arduous journey that they were about to make. Bahá'u'lláh then got into the ferry, went across to the garden, and he entered the garden. The garden was in full bloom with roses. The nightingales were just singing their melodies with their love of the fragrance of the roses. That evening, as Bahá'u'lláh was getting prepared to settle into the tents and the camp in that area, he held a meeting of the friends, and it was at that point that he announced that he was him whom God would make manifest, the promised one of all ages, the one spoken of in all the books of the past. That instant was a revolutionary point in the turning point of humanity, in my opinion. I think the universe changed at that instance. It was not the same universe that we had known the day before. I think all things were made new. A new operation was taking place in the life of humanity.
Baha'u'lláh traveled from Baghdad to Constantinople at the invitation of Sultan Abdulaziz, who was not only the ruler of the Ottoman Empire, but also the Caliph, leader of the Sunni sect of Islam. The difficult journey to the capital of the Ottoman Empire took 110 days. The caravan consisted of Baha'u'lláh, his family, 26 of his followers, and 11 soldiers to protect them. They had first to cross the desert, walking at night to escape the blistering heat. Most of the exiles walked the 40 to 50 kilometers they averaged every day. Sometimes they were so exhausted that they fell asleep on their feet. As the caravan traveled further into Kurdish territory, food grew scarce because the countryside was in the throes of a terrible famine. The mules and horses grew too weak to carry their loads. In the high mountainous areas near the borders of Iraq, the temperatures dropped below freezing, and the snow lay thick on the ground. Provisions ran out, and the exiles were forced to sell their horses to buy what food they could find. When they reached Constantinople, Baha'u'lláh settled his family in a small house. His reputation spread quickly, and every day people came to consult him, attracted by his majesty and profound knowledge. They were amazed that he did not go to the royal court to petition Sultan Abdulaziz for favors, as everyone else did. This unusual behavior puzzled and annoyed the Sultan, but Baha'u'lláh maintained that he was in Constantinople as a guest, and his focus was on spiritual and moral issues. When representatives of the Persian government whispered that Baha'u'llah's growing influence in the capital was dangerous, the fickle Sultan signed the order to have him exiled to Adrianople. In Adrianople, Baha'u'lláh decided the time had come for the whole world to learn what the Babi community already knew, that God had sent a new messenger as the Bab had foretold, one with new spiritual and social teachings for all humanity. Baha'u'llah's announcement took the form of a series of bold proclamations addressed to the most powerful kings and rulers, the leaders of religion, and the peoples of the world. Sultan Abdulaziz, the Ottoman Emperor, Nasir-ed-Din Shah, the King of Persia, Napoleon III of France, Kaiser Wilhelm I of Germany, Queen Victoria of Britain, and Tsar Alexander II of Russia were among those who received tablets from Baha'u'lláh. With the exception of Queen Victoria, their reactions ranged from indifference to disdain. The tablet addressed to Queen Victoria praised her for abolishing slavery and for having entrusted the reins of counsel into the hands of the representatives of the people. In response, she remarked, "If this is of God, it will endure. If not, it can do no harm." Of all the monarchs addressed by Bahá'u'lláh, her dynasty is the only one which did not fall. When Napoleon III received Bahá'u'lláh's tablet calling on him to care for the poor and the weak, he reportedly threw the letter away, saying, "If this man is God, I am two gods." Bahá'u'lláh wrote to him a second time, saying,
For what thou hast done, thy kingdom shall be thrown into confusion, and thine empire shall pass from thine hands, as a punishment for that which thou hast wrought. Hath thy pomp made thee proud? By my life, it shall not endure. Nay, it shall soon pass away, unless thou holdest fast by this firm cord. We see abasement hastening after thee.
Less than a year later, the Franco-Prussian War would end in crushing defeat for Napoleon. France would fall into civil war, leading to the re-establishment of the Republic. Napoleon would be forced into exile, there to die in 1873. One 19th century scholar commented, "Certainly no nation in modern times has ever been subjected to a worse humiliation in so short a time." The Prussian Kaiser Wilhelm I, Emperor of Germany, was warned by Bahá'u'lláh that his victory over Napoleon would not bring security.
O banks of the Rhine, we have seen you covered in gore, inasmuch as the swords of retribution were drawn against thee, and you shall have another turn. And we hear the lamentations of Berlin, though she is today in conspicuous glory.
Bahá'u'lláh received no reply from the emperor. In 1888, Kaiser Wilhelm I would die following an assassination attempt. Two bloody world wars, both ending in defeat for Germany, were to prove Bahá'u'llah's predictions true. Sultan Abdulaziz had been the first ruler to receive a tablet from Bahá'u'lláh, written just prior to Bahá'u'lláh being ordered out of Constantinople by the very man who had invited him there. The Sultan had exiled him to Adrianople without investigating his claims, and would later sentence him to life imprisonment, prompting this message from Bahá'u'lláh.
Tell the king that this territory will pass out of his hands, and his affairs will be thrown into confusion. Not I speak these words, but God speaketh them.
Before long, all that Bahá'u'lláh had prophesied would come to pass. Ali Pasha, the Grand Vizier, would be toppled from power. The Sultan himself would be deposed in a palace coup and assassinated in 1876. In 1878, a disastrous war with Russia would result in the occupation of Adrianople and the siege of Constantinople. A Turkish captain in the war wrote, "May God never again make it the lot of a people to witness such times and such days. Truly, blood flowed beneath the trees and beneath the stones. The whole plain was bathed in blood, and consternation was such as no one had ever known." Though charged with no crime, Bahá'u'lláh lived in Adrianople as a prisoner of the state. This did not stop him from fearlessly proclaiming his mission, and at least there was no restriction preventing his followers from moving to Adrianople to be near him. Many of these people set up shops and businesses, becoming prosperous and influential. They had begun to call themselves Baha'is, follower of Baha', rather than the Babis, in recognition of Bahá'u'lláh as the one heralded by the Bab. Bahá'u'lláh relied increasingly on his eldest son, Abdul-Baha, to assume the burden of day-to-day affairs and to nurture the delicate relationships with a constantly changing corps of officials, without whose support life for the exiles could have been made very uncomfortable indeed. On the rare occasions when Bahá'u'lláh left his home to pray in the mosques or to go to the public baths, people were so moved by his majesty and charm that many spontaneously stood and bowed in respect as he passed. People from all strata of society became Baha'is. In July of 1868, Sultan Abdul Aziz issued another imperial edict ordering Bahá'u'llah's final banishment from Adrianople. The exiles set out from Adrianople on August the 12th, 1868, and after 4 days' travel by cart and wagon, arrived in the port of Gallipoli. They did not know what their final destination was to be, or how long the journey would take. It was August 21st, 1868, when the exiles were herded aboard a steamer in Gallipoli bound for Alexandria. There they were transferred to another ship. With little to eat, no room to lie down, and the unbearable stench, many of the passengers fell ill. The exiles endured 11 days of this misery before arriving at the port of Haifa, at the foot of Mount Carmel, which the prophet Isaiah called the mountain of the Lord. Many were so weak that they had to be carried off the ship. A few hours later, they were put on a sailing vessel which took them across the bay to Akka. There was no wind, so the short distance took 8 hours to cover. There was no shade to offer them relief from the sweltering summer sun. When they reached the sea gate to Akka, they had to wade ashore and enter the prison city under heavy guard. Hordes of people gathered on the rooftops to jeer at the god of the Persians. At the time, Akka was a penal colony of about 9,000 dangerous criminals, murderers, and political troublemakers who were not expected to survive for long there. The city had no clean water, and the air was so foul that it was said birds could not fly over the city and live. Akka seemed the perfect place to bring Bahá'u'llah's life quickly to an end, and his religious influence with it. When they entered the prison city, all the exiles, men, women, and children, were taken to the citadel and locked up without anything to eat or drink. The suffering of the babies and children was terrible, and the exiles cried out for water, but were ignored by the guards. The next morning they were given their first rations, 3 small loaves of salty black bread each, and brackish water. Typhoid killed 3 within the first few days, and all but 2 soon fell ill with malaria and dysentery. A few days after their arrival, the Sultan's imperial edict concerning the Persian exiles was read publicly in the principal mosque in Akka. They were called enemies of public order and purveyors of blasphemous and immoral ideas, and condemned to perpetual banishment, with the stipulation that they were to be held in the strictest confinement and forbidden to associate with each other or with the inhabitants of Akka. At first, all the prisoners were crowded into 2 bare rooms. They slept on the floors, which were thick with mud and filth, and littered with plaster that fell from the crumbling ceiling. The oppressive heat and stench were overpowering. It was in these cramped conditions, while closely guarded by 10 soldiers, that Baha'u'lláh wrote with prophetic calm,
Fear not, these doors shall be opened. My tent shall be pitched on Mount Carmel, and the utmost joy shall be realized.
One evening, Baha'u'llah's youngest son, Mirza Mehdi, was walking on the flat roof of the prison, deep in prayer, when he fell through an open skylight. As he lay dying in his father's arms, he begged Baha'u'lláh to accept his life as a sacrifice so that the pilgrims who made their way to Akka would be free to see their Lord. After 22 hours of agony, Mirza Mehdi died. Soon afterwards, as a result of the war between Turkey and Russia, more troops were stationed in Akka, and the citadel was needed for barracks. After 27 months of being locked inside, Baha'u'lláh was moved, albeit within the city walls, and so Mirza Mehdi's last wish was fulfilled. The many Baha'is who had quietly taken up residence in Akka and Haifa were able, after years of separation, to meet Baha'u'lláh once more.
Because Badi is the person that Baha'u'lláh used to give the letter to the king of Persia, which means Baha'u'lláh wanted to communicate with the king of Persia. He wanted to write a letter to the king of Persia, but he didn't want it to send it by mail. Did not want it to give it to the guards, to give to the king. He wanted it given to the king in his hand. Then in Persia there is this Badi. Badi's father was of course a Baha'i, but Badi was not. He was actually he was a highwayman, what we call today the armed robber. We know of armed robberies and things. He was a highwayman and was mischievous, and nobody ever thought Badi would have anything to do with God. And suddenly, Badi says, I'm a Baha'i, I'm a follower of Baha'u'lláh. And the people are surprised, his friends are surprised, and so on. And on top of that, he says, I want to go and see Baha'u'lláh. But Persia is very far, and he is in Akka. And how he goes, he doesn't mind. It is said that he used every way of getting there. He didn't have the money to travel in the caravanserais that were used at the time. So he used to, at some distances, he covered sitting at the bottom of the carriages and traveling long distances. Other distances he covered on foot. By the time he got to Akka, he was worn out, tired, tattered, and torn. But then he found the group of people, because the Baha'is were prohibited from going into the Akka area. So they were happy about sitting just across the bay, sitting there and looking towards the prison, and they knew the window that Baha'u'llah's cell was, and every morning Baha'u'lláh would put his hand with a white handkerchief, and the people, the Baha'is across there, would look at that hand and be happy. Oh, we've seen him, he's still alive. And then they would walk back all those thousands of miles, just because they've seen. When Badi came to those people, and he said he also has come to see Baha'u'lláh, they said, oh, fine, thank you. You are here. Yes, this is where we end. But he said, no. This is not where I end. This is where you end. I don't end here. I've come to see the blessed beauty. I must see him. Going into the prison city of Akka, there was the gate into the prison city. Then you go inside, then there's another gate which leads into the actual confinement area, the prison. Then within the prison, it looks like there must have been a medium security kind of prison. Then there was a high security section where there was the gallows, the people waiting for death penalties, and that's where Bahá'u'lláh was on an upper level, which means getting to where Bahá'u'lláh was, you had to go through gate 1, gate 2, gate 3, then into the cell, which was gate 4. All along there are guards guarding these places. What happened when Badi came to the first gate, all the guards did is came to attention, put up the key, opened the door for Badi. Badi went through. Second gate, same thing, attention, a nice salute, walk in through. Third gate, same thing, escort to Bahá'u'llah's door, open, and he walks in. And, okay, it's a thinking what was happening, but when Badi came to Bahá'u'lláh, Bahá'u'lláh uttered certain statements. He says, I created you for a purpose. I have summoned you from Persia for a purpose. And I congratulate you that you have come, you have answered, and this is the purpose. And the letter had already been written, and it was given to him, and Bahá'u'lláh gave him all the instructions and said, take this letter to the Shah of Iran, give it to him in his hand. I have chosen you because you are the only person that would be able to give it to him in his hand. And Bahá'u'lláh says, once you have given this letter to him, then you are going to be killed. During the Badi's travel back to Persia, he was confronted with a lot of difficulties, but he went through all those stages until he got to Persia. And when he got to Persia, they did not want him to, like it would be expected. Nobody wanted to take the letter. He said he wanted to see the king. They said, why do you want to see the king? Because I have a message for him. What message? Give it. He said, no, I'm not giving it to anyone. I want to give to the king. It's not for you, it's for the king. And they said, oh, crazy. Well, he went away and sat around the palace. He was sitting. One day the king is walking outside and with his men on horseback, hunting or doing whatever, wherever they were going. Then Badi sees the opportunity, rushes in between the guards, and on the face of the king, bam, this is a message for you. The king picks it up. Where does it come from? From Bahá'u'lláh. And when the message was opened, the guards did not want the king to read it. They took it from him and read it for him and told him whatever they chose to tell him. But then the persecution that followed for Badi just makes him one of the greatest martyrs of the time, because he was so persecuted, beaten. You know, the people of the time in Persia were the most cruel in the form of persecution and torture. Torture, in actual fact, maybe there shall come a time when people shall fear blood coming out of somebody's face, but those people didn't fear anything, so they put him through all kinds of torture, heat, battering and so on. And all the time he was calm, nice, and they reported to the king. They said, we've done everything to this person, but he's so calm, he's still smiling, he's still, and finally they blew him on the top of, in front of a gun and into pieces.
Though released from the confines of the citadel, Bahá'u'lláh was still a prisoner. He lived under house arrest in several different locations within the city walls, devoting his time to the completion of the proclamations to the kings and rulers, which had been interrupted by his swift departure from Adrianople, and to the revelation of the numerous tablets and books, notably the Kitab-i-Aqdas, the Most Holy Book. Bahá'u'lláh relied almost entirely on Abdul-Baha to manage daily activities, as he had told his son he would upon their arrival in Akka.
Now I concentrate on my work of writing commands and counsels for the world of the future. To thee I leave the province of talking with and ministering to the people. Servitude is the essence of worship. I have finished with the outer world. Henceforth I meet only the disciples.
Bahá'u'lláh had lived for 9 years in Akka's barren dust bowl when he began to express his longing to experience once again the beauty of nature. This saddened Abdul-Baha, who determined to do everything he could to fulfill his father's wish. Though still prisoners, their living conditions had been greatly eased by the good relations they enjoyed with the authorities of Akka. Abdul-Baha approached the governor with an idea, and with his encouragement managed to rent an abandoned farm called Mazra'i outside Akka and have it restored for Bahá'u'lláh. Although the Sultan's edict of life imprisonment had never been formally withdrawn, Abdulaziz himself had been overthrown and assassinated in a palace coup the year before. In June 1877, Bahá'u'lláh walked unhindered through the gates of Akka. Though technically still a prisoner of the state, no one in Akka had any desire to enforce the dead Sultan's edict. Bahá'u'lláh spent 2 years in Mazra'i before moving to Baji, a large mansion surrounded by gardens, which Abdul-Baha had rented and later purchased for him. He continued to live simply and spent much of his time in a nearby garden, which the Baha'is had prepared for him, often sleeping in a small cottage there. Several times he visited Akka and Haifa, and more than once he pitched his tent on Mount Carmel in fulfillment of his promise made while a closely guarded prisoner. On one of those occasions he pointed out the spot where the holy remains of the Bab were to be buried, and a beautiful shrine constructed to honor him. In 1886, Bahá'u'llah's beloved wife, Nawab, died. She had been his constant companion for 51 years, most of it in poverty, exile, and imprisonment. Her gentle and generous heart had helped to create an atmosphere of peace and happiness, no matter where they were. Despite his sorrow, Bahá'u'llah's revelation of tablets continued unchecked. He continued to meet the Baha'i pilgrims, but rarely granted audiences to others. On one occasion, he agreed to see the Cambridge scholar Edward Granville Brown, who has left a moving description of that meeting.
Edward Granville Brown was an Englishman who was born in Gloucestershire and had a fairly unremarkable childhood and youthhood, as far as I know. He went to Eton College, didn't seem to have been very happy at college, and then went to Cambridge University, where he studied medicine. He studied at Pembroke College in Cambridge, and was, when he finished his studies, offered a fellowship there. But during the time he was studying medicine, he became very fascinated with the Middle East, and he learnt Turkish, and consequently, after having studied Turkish and mastered it quite well, moved on to study Persian and Arabic. This fascination led to him reading a lot about developments in the Middle East, and he was particularly taken by a book by the Comte de Gobineau, who was the French historian, who wrote a book called Religions and Philosophies in Central Asia. And Gobineau devoted quite a lot of his book to the story of the Bab and the way that the Babi movement had swept across Persia and had created such an upheaval. And Professor Brown looked at the story of the Bab and became quite captivated by it. He was really very in awe of the amount of bloodshed that had taken place, the degree of heroism and sacrifice and martyrdoms that had gone on. And he thought that this was quite a rare occurrence, and he recognized that there were similarities in the way that the Babi faith had been born and the kind of adversity and tribulation that it had come up against. And there were similarities between that and the kind of events that came along with the birth of the other major world religions. So when he finished his medical degree and had just received his fellowship at Pembroke College, he went off and spent time in Persia. And he wrote a book as a result of this journey called A Year Among the Persians, which became very much a classic of its kind. And his main reason for going to Persia was to try and track down Babis and to find out something about them. But of course, they'd all been pushed underground because of the persecutions, and he found it very difficult to find many Babis to talk to. And then when he did find some, they were very secretive and wanted to test his sincerity before they told him very much. In the 1890s, he spent time traveling to Cyprus to meet Baha'u'llah's half-brother, Mirza Yahya, and also to Akka to meet Baha'u'lláh himself, who by now was very elderly and who was resident in the mansion at Baji. This experience that Professor Brown had in Akka is completely unsurpassed and unparalleled in Baha'i history. He's one of the very few Westerners to have come into contact with Baha'u'lláh, and uniquely, he's probably the only Westerner that we know of who left a pen portrait, who left a description of what it was like to meet Baha'u'lláh. He had 4 interviews during that time in the mansion at Baji, and during that time he was able to write down many of the things that Baha'u'lláh had said to him and the kind of impression that Baha'u'lláh made on him. And this is unique. I think many of the Eastern Baha'is were too in awe of Baha'u'lláh to say too much about him. They felt unworthy of actually describing what he looked like or what it was like to be in his presence. But because Professor Brown was a Westerner, because he had this academic inquiring mind, and perhaps because he didn't have the kind of allegiance that the declared Baha'is as such would have had, he was able to leave quite a objective, nevertheless wonderful pen portrait. He was staying in the mansion of Baji at the time and was overwhelmed really by the spirit of the place. He felt like he was moving in a sort of very heightened atmosphere, and that the love and the unity that was present around the mansion and the spirit that was around the mansion was unique. He left the description as follows. He says, "During the morning of the day after my installation at Baji, one of Baha'u'llah's younger sons entered the room where I was sitting and beckoned me to follow him. I did so and was conducted through passages and rooms at which I scarcely had time to glance, to a spacious hall paved, so far as I remember, for my mind was occupied with other things, with a mosaic of marble. Before a curtain suspended from a wall of this great antechamber, my conductor paused for a moment while I removed my shoes. Then with a quick movement of the hand he withdrew, and as I passed, replaced the curtain, and I found myself in a large apartment along the upper end of which ran a low divan, while on the side opposite to the door were placed 2 or 3 chairs. This is a room that pilgrims who go to Haifa now and go to visit the mansion of Baji can go and visit. It's the room in which Baha'u'lláh actually passed away. Though I dimly suspected whither I was going and whom I was to behold, for no distinct intimation had been given to me, a second or 2 elapsed ere, with a throb of wonder and awe, I became definitely conscious that the room was not untenanted. In the corner where the divan met the wall sat a wondrous and venerable figure, crowned with a felt headdress of the kind called Taj by dervishes, but of unusual height and make, round the base of which was wound a small white turban. The face of him on whom I gazed I can never forget, though I cannot describe it. Those piercing eyes seemed to read one's very soul. Power and authority sat on that ample brow, while the deep lines on the forehead and face implied an age which the jet-black hair and beard flowing down in indistinguishable luxuriance almost to the waist seemed to belie. No need to ask in whose presence I stood, as I bowed myself before one who is the object of a devotion and love which kings might envy and emperors sigh for in vain. And then Bahá'u'lláh speaks to Professor Brown. A mild, dignified voice bade me be seated, and then continued, "Praise be to God that thou hast attained. Thou hast come to see a prisoner and an exile. We desire but the good of the world and the happiness of the nations. Is not this that which Christ foretold? Yet do we see your kings and rulers lavishing their treasures more freely on means for the destruction of the human race than on that which would conduce to the happiness of mankind. These strifes and this bloodshed and discord must cease, and all men be as one kindred and one family. Let not a man glory in this, that he loves his country. Let him rather glory in this, that he loves his kind." And then Professor Brown writes, and this comes actually from the preface he wrote to the Traveller's Narrative, the translation that he made of Abdu'l-Bahá's book. "Such, so far as I can recall them, were the words which, besides many others, I heard from Bahá. Let those who read them consider well with themselves whether such doctrines merit death and bonds, and whether the world is more likely to gain or lose by their diffusion."
Bahá'u'lláh died at Baji on the 29th of May, 1892, after a brief illness. His mission had been completed. His books and tablets, consisting of thousands of pages, contained the framework and laws of a new world order, and the spiritual teachings mankind would need to build and live in that new world. His religion was poised to break free of the Orient, to establish itself throughout the world. And perhaps most importantly, the unity of the Bahá'í faith itself had been assured through his appointment of a successor. The last tablet revealed by Bahá'u'lláh before his passing was the Book of the Covenant. In it he appointed Abdu'l-Bahá as the interpreter of his teachings and the center of his covenant. Bahá'u'llah's final gift to the world was his son, Abdu'l-Bahá, whom he called the Mystery of God, the perfect exemplar of what a Bahá'í should and could be.
We are the Aba, the Zulu, the Acholi, the Zapotec. We are from Angola, Algeria, Zambia. We are Colombians, Aitsoum, French, Tangali, Finns, Ojibwa, Greek. We are the Aymara, the Mayans, the Dutch, the Yoruba, the Cree, the Inuit. We are from Tuvalu, Spain, Luxembourg, Argentina, Zimbabwe, Suriname.
We are the Poles, the Greenlanders, the Pakistanis, the Bank Islanders, the Maori, the Andangme. We are Mexican, Apache, Comorian, Swedes, Tigray. We are from Botswana, South Africa, Papua New Guinea, Equatorial Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Martinique, Guadeloupe, Ireland, Uzbekistan, Canada.
We are Germans, Sara, Guaymi, Somalis, Ekoi, Lebanese. We are the Babwa, the Babilis, the Tlingit, the people of Cameroon, the Oromo, the Haida, the Balante. We are Panamanians, Iroquois, Vietnamese, English. We are from Sikkim, Transkei, Andaman and Nicobar Islands, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, St. Kitts and Nevis, Honduras, New Caledonia and the Loyalty Islands, Rwanda, Vanuatu.
We are the Latvians, the Lakota, the Arapaho, the Yami, the Yo, the Bribri. We are Australian, Torres Strait Islanders, Salish, Pygmies, Nepalese, Mauritanians. We are from the Bahamas, Scotland, Argentina, Belize, Hungary, Kiribati, the United Arab Emirates. We are the Welsh, Bapedi, the Quechua, the Bolivians, the Cook Islanders, the Austrians.
We are the Brazilians, the Kru, the Blackfoot, the Gurage, Sidama. We are from Uganda, Uruguay, Barbados, Botswana, the Federated States of Micronesia, Bophuthatswana. We are from the Cayman Islands, the Canary Islands, the Fiji Islands, Jamaica. We're Belgian, Kazi, Juka, Azerbaijani, Persian, Albanian, Syrian, Marshall Islanders.
We are the North Americans,
The South Americans,
The Asians,
the Australasians, the Europeans.
the Africans.
We are the people of the world.